I met Bob, I think it was in 2015 and at an Adobe conference in DC. And I was really impressed by how knowledgeable he was on, at that time, DFARS 252-204-7012 and what he was doing with Adobe. Adobe had some kind of tool out that they were trying to sell, and it was astronomically expensive. But yet, Bob was there, and not as an Adobe representative, but just at the conference. And so I just remember him being like swarmed with people around him as like a mecca of information for this DFARS 7012 regulation and how it could impact the defense industrial base. And a lot of people still weren't really taking it to heart, but he has, and he always has been. He's been an advocate of defending of cybersecurity and the defense in depth of our defense industrial base. I've been on a panel with him a few times with an NDIA event up in DC, and we keep running into each other, especially with the Cmc regulation that is out now. So, Bob, can you hear us, sir?
I can. I think my video is being controlled on your side. If it's possible to use the video, great. Otherwise I can put this giant regulation on the screen.
Give us a couple minutes and we'll see if we can't get the video working. If not, we might just have to go with your PowerPoint presentation, sir, and listen to your wonderful voice.
Well, I am PowerPoint free, and the reason is that I agreed, a couple of days ago to switch from the topic of talking about the threat to maybe the more immediate concern of the challenge that is presented by this new interim DFARS that in its pre-publication form was 89 pages long. I thought that some of the participants in your program might want to hear me attempt to explain not just kind of why it's here, but what it is and some of the key features of how it works. Now, if we do need to have something to look at, I will put up the regulation here. I think you can see this now. Tell me, someone tell me if you can see the regulation?
Yes, sir. We can see it, Bob.
I'm not quite hearing that. I'm going to assume that you are.
We can see it, sir. Yep.
Perfect. And as I'm sure everybody appreciates, it is self-explanatory, and no one would have any trouble kind of committing this thing to memory in a few days. Unfortunately, I won't claim that. I have read it several times, and I have prepared a summary analysis, which I'm happy to make available to those who are interested through you or through whomever you designate. So let's start, if we might, by looking at a document that some of you will get to know much better than you know already. It's not just this regulation. Back in November of 2019, DoD published something prepared by Dcma, which is described as the NIST SP 800-171 Dod Assessment Methodology. And that's going to become important, as you'll see, because it is that methodology that many companies in the defense industrial base will first have to use, not only to prepare a self-assessment, but to provide that self-assessment and to submit it to DoD. I'm pointing to one of the first pages of this document, and it says the DFARS provision 252-204-7008, compliance with safeguarding covered defense information controls, requires, among other things, offerors to represent that they will implement the security requirements in NIST 800-171 in effect at the time the solicitation is issued or is authorized by the contracting officer. It also says, here I paraphrase, that to document the implementation of 171, a contractor is to document a system security plan. And if the security requirements are not complete, companies must develop and implement plans of action to describe when and how those unimplemented security requirements will be met. Well, one way to look at this lengthy and complex new regulation is that a sizable fraction of it is intended to find out whether you did, if you will, what you were told back when that 2008 clause first appeared in your contract. And the core of the assessment is, in fact, dependent upon SSPs, assuming that you have created one, and POAMs, and we'll talk about how that works. Now, I'll pause for just a moment because it's possible that some of you listening to this are saying, well, wait a second, this is about CMMC, and I know for sure that CMMC doesn't concern POAMs. They're anathema. They're not allowed. And CMMC is, it's part 171, but it's more and different. Well, that's right, but one of the key propositions to consider as you start to get to know this new regulation is that you might think of it as sort of two regulations for the same purpose combined into one. In fact, it describes itself as exhibiting a two-pronged approach. And the first prong is this DoD assessment, which is to be done by Dcma, not C3PAOs. The DoD assessment is to be done by Dcma along the lines of what it's been doing for the DIB-CAC program. And it is based entirely upon 171, and it uses not the new assessment methodologies for CMMC, but the existing DoD assessment methodology that was first published by DoD in November 2019. Why do I say that there's two regulations in one? Well, it's because we have essentially a 5-year ramp where we start slowly with CMMC, and at the end of 5 years, every new solicitation will include a CMMC requirement. Until then, only some, initially only a few. But effective November 30th, you can expect that every solicitation to a DoD contractor is going to include both a new -19 and -20 clause that first tell you that if you bid on a solicitation, you're going to be subject to the DoD assessment rules. And then second, tell you that if you get the contract, you are going to have the required level of assessment in place at the time of contract award. Now, one of the things I want to make clear is that this it's a new procedure for DoD assessment that's using an older methodology. The crucial difference is that now you have to make a submission to DoD of a self-assessed score for the basic level assessment. And you could be subject to a higher level assessment, medium or high, also to be done by Dcma. And these obligations do not apply to the entire defense industrial base. They do not apply to companies who only are subject to the FAR basic safeguarding rule. And they do not apply to companies who do not have the 7012 cybersecurity clause. But if you have the 7012 clause and you already are in possession of or generate controlled and classified information, then you can expect that you will see future solicitations which will require you to go through this DoD assessment methodology, which, as I'm attempting to explain, is for the same purpose as CMMC and related to it, but different in operation, and which will have a more immediate effect upon a larger number of companies. I do want to mention also, though, because the details are in the weeds and I'm continuing to rake, the leaves and find the weeds. One of the things to note here is that although this DoD assessment methodology has broad impact and it will undoubtedly affect most, maybe everyone listening to this program, it is not going to be implemented through a change in any existing requirement. So if you have a contract with a 7012 clause, what that tells you is that when you get a solicitation for another contract that's subject to 7012, well, then you're going to see these new clauses, the 19 and 20 clause, that impose this DoD assessment rule. You could also see the new clauses apply if there is an option exercise. You could also see it apply if there is a change made to that contract. But if you are performing an existing contract and it does not have these new clauses, and there is no modification or change or option extension, well, you may be able to, quote, escape, unquote, the application of the new clause. But I suspect most of you attending this program want to continue to do business with the Department of Defense, and for that reason, you should be expecting you will get these new clauses. Now, I've mentioned two of the new clauses so far, 19 and 20. 19 is the one that essentially notifies you that by solicitation term that you're going to be subject to this DoD assessment requirement. And 20 is the version, similar clause in a different version that will actually appear in and bind your conduct under the contract. There's a third new clause, which is -21. It's shorter. And what it says is this: if the requiring activity has determined that your contract is one where CMMC applies and a requirement for CMMC maturity has been set either in the requirements or in the statement of work, then you will be subject to that requirement and you must have a CMMC certification at the level that is specified in the contract at the time of award. All the details matter. Now, I said earlier, I think that we have this kind of long ramp to get CMMC up and running. Well, the way it works is this. The DoD assessment mechanism is going to apply more or less instantly. You're going to see it appear in solicitations beginning November 30th. But only a small number of new solicitations and contracts are going to be subject to CMMC initially. In order for CMMC to apply to a current contract, not only must the requiring activity decide to do it, the requiring activity must cause language to appear, I think, in section C or L of a new solicitation that will tell you that it's subject to CMMC and will tell you the certification level that's required at a prime contract level. But even then, before a new solicitation can impose the CMMC requirement, different than DoD assessment, before a new solicitation will impose that CMMC requirement, it actually has to be approved by the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Acquisition and Sustainment, which means Katie Arrington's PMO organization. And the way I read it is that the decision was made to first hold industry's feet to the proverbial charcoals or fire for what they should already have been doing to comply with 171 and to conform to the existing 7012 clause. And then more gradually, we are going to see an increasing number of companies who are held to the similar but differently executed requirements of CMMC. It's not that no one will see CMMC in 2021. You will. Katie said a couple of days ago that the initial rollout for CMMC is 15 contracts. Well, they're assuming 150 subcontracts for each, and those are 15 independent, non-duplicative prime contracts. So my math isn't that great, but if I assume an average of 150 subs and 15 contracts, that means that there are going to be 2,250 companies who will see the -21 CMMC clause in their solicitation, who will find it in their contract, who will be required to flow it down to every subcontractor except exclusive COTS. And therefore, there are going to be 2,250 subcontractors who, at the very least, are going to have a level 3 CMMC assessment done. Sorry, at very least a level 1 CMMC assessment. But for many, I think we're going to find as the year progresses, the fiscal year, that the CMMC certificate will be required at level 3. Now, 2,250 companies on 15 prime contracts, well, that's certainly enough to get your feet wet, but that's a fairly small fraction of the total number of contracts and contracting actions that are taken by DoD in a year. In contrast, the numbers are not quite fixed. We can expect at least 20,000 companies to have to address this DoD assessment requirement, which I've said before is a bit different. The DoD assessment requirement does not involve the CMMC Accreditation Board. It does not involve the CMMC maturity levels. It does not involve the CMMC model. It is strictly 171 based, and if there is any on-site assessment to be done, it will be conducted by Dcma or some other government agency. So, there's a lot of questions, of course, as to how all of this is going to work. I think that fundamentally DoD has made a sound decision to initially emphasize assessments according to 800-171, and initially to take an approach to administration that involves a small number of on-site visits. But no one should be under the illusion that this new regulation gives a free pass to those who are in the defense industrial base. It does not, in my view. So what I'm going to try to do now is to kind of walk through an outline, which hopefully will take us through to the structure, strategy, and operation of the rule. So, I've said that the interim rule, first let's discuss an interim rule. We had all thought, and most of us had hoped, that we would see the CMMC rule as a proposed rule subject to notice and comment. We figured we would have 60 days to read it, to digest it, to comment upon it, to consult with others similarly positioned. We figured there might be public hearings, and then we figured there would be several months of time in which the various comments would be digested, before which we would see a final rule that would affect us. But that's not what happened. What happened is we got an interim rule, which will be effective according to its terms 30 days from when the interim rule was released, or November 30th. Yes, we have an opportunity to make comments on the interim rule, but those comments are due in 60 days, and we don't know when there will be a final rule, or whether there might be another interim rule after the first one before there is a final one. Such things are within DoD's authority. It has the power to decide that something is urgent enough and the circumstances are compelling, and it exercised its authority. It's done that in many other circumstances, which we could discuss another time. It does present all of us a bit of a challenge, because suddenly we have a very complex rule that, with details that few people were expecting, that almost no one outside DoD knew, which we have to plan to comply with right now, and where we're going to start to see at least the DoD assessment clauses in our solicitations and contracts in a matter of a few weeks. That's a lot to deal with. And there are quite a number of administrative or operational concerns, which I'm sure DoD will work with to solve, but which are going to cause many of you listening to wonder exactly how you are going to reconcile what this describes to your business and your state of cybersecurity. And as is true, in many situations like this, it's one thing to have a rule which has high concepts that everybody agrees with. This is one. We all want to improve the cybersecurity and protection of controlled unclassified information, but those details about how you actually achieve those laudable public purposes can be expensive and difficult. So we have an interim rule, and it is to implement two distinct but related assessments. As I mentioned, the first is the assessment in accordance with NIST 800-171, and the second is the assessments to come eventually in accordance with the CMMC framework. And one thing to mention is that under both schemes, if an assessment is required of you at under a DoD assessment or CMMC, the assessment is not only one that you must have at the point of contract award when it is required, you also have to maintain it for the duration of the contract. And there's nothing said in the new rule about exactly what maintain is, nor is it said exactly how that is going to be done. But most of you on the call recognize that there is a difference between a static sort of checklist or test approach that says on a particular day you are compliant, and having that plus some mechanism internal at least to sustain compliance over time where the threat may evolve or your business circumstances may change. So you have to have the certificate or the assessment level at the point of contract award, or you won't get it. But once you have it, you got to maintain it. So let's divide the rule into its two prongs, the DoD assessment prong and the CMMC prong. that first prong calls for assessment of your 171 security requirements. And those are imposed on you by the 7012 safeguarding clause, and they apply to covered contractor information systems. If you had problems before knowing which systems were subject to this requirement, or if you were uncertain as to whether information in your possession was or was not CUI, I wish I could tell you that those problems are solved by the new regulations, but they are not. The new regulations essentially adopt the same definition of covered contractor system, and the new regulations do not tell you anything different about who is responsible to identify CUI or how it's done. DoD, however, has just put up a new site which is intended to better instruct contracting officers and other government personnel on identification of CUI. So when you go on with that first prong of the rule, the Dod assessment methodology is described as establishing a standard scoring methodology. And the words here are important. It is to reflect the net effect of 800-171 security requirements not yet implemented. And there are 3 assessment levels: basic, medium, and high. Well, if you go back to that November document that I mentioned earlier, which I think I can pull up and put on the screen here, which would be worthwhile. Let me give it a try. I am working on it. Doesn't seem that it's going to happen, so I'll have to take it on faith. So the November 2019 assessment methodology, the way it operates is to assume that if you have perfect satisfaction of NIST's 110 requirements, you will have, sorry, I just dropped my mouse. You will have a score of 110. Now, if you thought that missing a requirement would cause you to lose a single point, you might be right, but you probably are wrong. And that is because, one second. The way that the scoring mechanism works is that it recognizes that some of the 171 requirements are more important than others, and that the impact of failing to meet some is more consequential than failing to meet others. So of the 110 requirements, some of them, in fact, a pretty sizable number are given a 5-point score, and others are given a 3-point. And if I recall correctly, there's even some of the 110 requirements that are worth 2 points. Well, if you were to fail to fulfill 5 of the requirements that have a 5-point score, you would lose a total of 25 points from the maximum of 110. And if you really have done a bad job and have accomplished very little, it's actually possible that when you do the self-assessment, you would have a negative score. And in fact, Katie Arrington mentioned on a program I was on with her earlier today that there have been examples as they test this out of negative scores. Well, so that's important. Now, you're not going to see this requirement of the DoD assessment until solicitations that come after November 30th. And when you do see it, you're likely to see it expressed in this way. This basic assessment, you are to use the methodology documented by DoD in November 2019 to come up with this net effect. And then you are to report yourself to the Supplier Performance Risks Reporting System, SPRS, what your net score is. There's some other details that you are to include. Among the details to include are when you expect to close any of the gaps. Now, a small percentage of everyone who has the 7012 clause and who has CUI will be required to make this self-assessment at the basic level and to report it when they get the new clause and before they receive an award subject to the new clause. Now that could be as many as 20,000 companies, maybe more, because for big companies, You actually have to make the self-assessment for each of the relevant information systems, and I think there could even be multiple self-assessments for different cage codes reflecting different industries that you work in. Obviously, this rule is going to take some time to understand. I'm doing my best. So, we're going to go from a situation where SPRS may have a couple of hundred couple of hundred DoD assessment scores from the work of the DBCAC over the last year or two, to where there's going to be thousands of them coming in. And so it's not surprising that included somewhere in the rule regulation that it was issued is language that says you're not required to do these things now, but you're encouraged to make these basic assessments and submit them immediately. And that, I think, is to try to manage the workflow or the information flow into SPRS. Well, is DoD, what is DoD thinking here? I think it's pretty straightforward. They are thinking that most companies that have the 7012 clause and have CUI have been on notice since at least 2015 that they are supposed to satisfy 171. And technically, since January 1st, 2018, every contract you take, you are essentially affirming that you do provide adequate security in satisfaction of 171. So DoD's theory in this DoD assessment mechanism is that it's not such a big deal, because if you've already done it, as is implied by your taking the contracts, then all you have to do is total up the few gaps and submit that score. In actuality, I suspect there's going to be a significant number of companies whose, if they did a self-assessment today, they would find their score was not especially high. Now, here's an interesting point. This DoD assessment mechanism depends upon the system security plan. That's what you use to essentially describe the architecture of your system. And then with the system security plan, you conduct a self-assessment. That self-assessment produces gaps. The gaps are what you intend to close by POAM, and you essentially, remove from your maximum total score those requirements which are subject to the POAM. None of that is relevant to or helps you if and when you're subject to a CMMC certification level. As you have read before, it remains the gospel inviolate truth of CMMC that there are 130 requirements that you are expected to meet for a level 3 certification. You are obliged to meet all 130, and there is no room for and no acceptance of a POAM. This is a change. So let's talk about these 3 levels of assessment: basic, medium, and high. Everybody has to self-assess and submit themselves the basic assessment, unless perhaps you've already been subject to a Dcma DBCAC audit. Now, it isn't clear immediately who will be subject to either a medium or a high assessment. In both cases, a medium or high assessment involves some activity by Dcma or some other government entity. And you, by operation of these new clauses, agree to give them access to your facilities and have a right to see some of your documentation. What a medium assessment is essentially a kind of a moderate risk assessment where they come in and look at your documentation. I don't think they do any highly intrusive tests. Those can be done under a high assessment. High assessments are just reserved for kind of high impact programs, key technologies. Dcma estimates that a very, very small percentage of the companies who are subject to the DoD assessment rule will get a high assessment, and still quite a small percentage of the total will get even a medium assessment, which is less intrusive. But you don't know when you submit your basic assessment, and conceptually, anybody who submits a basic assessment for anything, for any contract at any level, I think might find that they are subject to a Dcma medium assessment, or Dcma comes on site. And if or when that happens, Dcma is going to want to see what? Well, they're going to want to see your system security plan, and they're going to want to see the documentation of your self-assessment, and they're going to want to see your POAMs, and they're going to be pretty interested in what backs up what you reported as to when those POAMs would be closed. And so even if you think you're in a moderate impact, low impact, whatever, even if you think you're an unlikely candidate for a medium on-site assessment or a high on-site assessment, you have to recognize the possibility that if one comes, you better have documentation that conforms to your self-assessment as you provided and submitted to SPRS. Speaking here for a moment as a lawyer, I would tell you that it would be a very, very bad thing to submit a self-assessment with a high basic number where you knew that it was false. Because these assessments become part of the basis on which your eligibility for new contracts are determined. Essentially, you could be committing a false claim and expose yourself to the severe sanctions of the False Claims Act if you either knowingly misstate the basic state of your cybersecurity, or if you provide a number that's in reckless disregard of the truth. And I think the same exposure is present, although a little differently, as to the predictions that you are required to submit as to when you are going to close the gaps that keep you from 110 perfect score. So here's another thing that doesn't quite leap out at you in the regulation, but is true. All right, so everybody has to do the basic assessment, and the maximum score you get is 110. Well, one question is, if you submit it today and it's at 72, can you do it again in a month and resubmit it? Doesn't say, but I have no reason to think you can't. Also, the big question, the money question is, all right, if I submit the truth and I'm at 75 today and it's going to take me a year and a half to get to 110, what does that mean? I don't know. I mean, because there's really nothing in the regulation today that says what DoD is to do or how it is to act upon a low assessment. Still, if I were a company looking to work with the sophisticated primes on significant military programs, I think the smart move from a business standpoint is to have a higher score rather than a lower score. If Lockheed, let's say if Northrop Grumman is looking to add subcontractors to a hypothetical B-21, well, let's do it first this way. When you submit these scores to SPRS, again, based on the net, result of your evaluation using this established methodology, you, the contractor, submit them to SPRS, and you, the contractor, have the ability to see them. But no one else other than government people do. So what this means is that if you are going to be a prime contractor, you're going to be asking yourself how your prospective buyer will react to your honest submission of a score of 72. You're probably going to be thinking that you'll want a higher score because you won't know what the buyer will do, but you wouldn't want the adverse possibility. We really don't know that, and it's something we need to ask. It's an ask that goes not just to DCMA, and really not just to OSD, because the ultimate purpose of these scoring mechanisms is not just to satisfy DCMA. It's an oversight organization. It's not just to satisfy OSD, which has authority over the acquisition process in some programs. Ultimately, the purpose of these assessments and of your compliance is to protect the interest of the requiring activity or the program office and your ability to keep confidential their technical information. And so it is possible that for some programs that a requiring activity would not just be interested academically in the basic assessment score of its primes, it could conceivably, maybe, decide to put in a requirement that says, I'm only interested in getting bids from people that have a score over 90. I don't know that they will do that. My team at my law firm, we are looking at whether they could put in requirements or set eligibility criteria, or even consider whether companies can be, recall that the last thing a contracting officer has to do before actually making an award decision is to confirm that you intended awardee are a presently responsible contractor. And mostly what that involves now is sort of looking at system for award management, making sure there's no debarment actions pending, making sure that you're an honest and forthcoming compliant contractor. Another possibility, and I want to put a circle around that, just a possibility, and I'm looking at this also, is that maybe the requiring activity that really does care what your basic self-assessment score is will decide that it is going to add some special responsibility criteria, such as to say, I don't consider you specially responsible unless you can satisfy me that at the time of award, you will have a minimum score of 90 or 95. These are big questions because I think it would really be uncomfortable to have thousands of scores going in to SPRS, System of Information Available to Contracting Officers, and requiring activities. You don't want thousands of those scores that show that instead of the 110 you were supposedly getting because of your continued adequate security since 2018, that the industry average might be half that. Now, is this just conjecture that this could happen? Absolutely not. I was on a conversation last Friday with a Dcma official, and that official said, who is responsible for DBCAC, and he said that approximately 25% of the companies that they have assessed have achieved the full 110 score. And I won't go into what some of the other outcomes are, but Katie has said there are examples where companies have negative numbers in those scores. So certainly this DoD basic assessment requirement is going to motivate everybody to report a higher score. But what it should never motivate you to do is to falsify that score. It is crucial that you do the work, spend the time, spend the money, get the people, use the assets, find the resources to get that score up, because there is that possibility that you're going to be checked against it in a medium assessment. And there is also a possibility, frankly, that if an ugly breach were to occur, and then some sort of inquiry or even investigation might be made, it would be very bad for you as a contractor to have self-reported a high security score only to have a breach occur and a subsequent investigation reveal that you hadn't done the things that you said you would. That's taking a serious and difficult problem and turning it into liability for fraud potentially or even criminal exposure. I do not think that cybersecurity is an area which should be the subject of exploitation by other lawyers, not me, for False Claims Act and the like. But part of the span of measures available to the government to make sure that you do comply is the possibility of actions that are brought by the government or by whistleblowers if they are dissatisfied with a company's the truth of or integrity of a company's self-reporting. Now, what is CMC? How is it different? I mean, it sounds like this DoD assessment is quite enough. Well, CMC is quite different. Most of us have been following it pretty carefully, and there's a couple things to consider. The DoD assessment mechanism is not scalable, right? I mean, it involves a finite number of Dcma assessors. Maybe there are a couple of hundred of them now. There's no possible way that those Dcma assessors are going to be able to go out and verify anything at all 20,000 or so companies that presently are subject to 7012 and which presently have CUI. It's not going to happen. And moreover, one of the purposes of CMMC is to do assessments not only at companies subject to 7012, but to do assessments at many, many more companies who have federal contract information and who are subject to the FAR basic safeguarding rule. There might be 200,000 of those companies who would be subject to a level 1 assessment. And there is no counterpart to level 1 in the DoD assessment mechanism. So CMMC is intended to be scalable, but that's true only as the accreditation board makes a lot more progress with the efforts that are now in their relative infancy. We have a couple of dozen provisional assessors. We don't have any formally accredited C3 PAOs, much less organization we don't have any formally accredited level 3 assessors, much less accrediting organization. It's going to take time, a couple of years, to have enough of those assessors who can actually take CMMC to the scale intended. And looking just at the defense industrial base, that scale is 220,000 companies, most of whom will be at level 1. 20,000 or so will be at level 2, and there's going to be some number for whom level sorry, 20,000 or so will be at level 3. And there'll be some number who are subject to higher level requirements, levels 4 and 5. And that's a different set of requirements. Now, the theory of CMMC is that you have private assessors accredited by the Accreditation Board who are going to do this. And that the initial mechanism to resolve any disagreements about an assessment or its result is going to be between the company being assessed and the assessor, or between the company being assessed and the Accreditation Board. It's not clear yet, what means there will be for companies who disagree with the AB's outcome to take their disagreement to DoD. Nor is it clear whether requiring activities will have the authority to make exceptions or to allow POAMs to be present, notwithstanding a CMMC score that is less than intended. Now, CMMC also has a different set of requirements. Most of you listening here know this already. CMMC is certainly built around NIST 800-171, but it is, if you will, modernized and expanded. Those who prepared the CMMC model picked up some other stuff from ISO, from NIST 172 for levels 4 and 5, from other, from UK framework and other sources. There's 20 additional practices and policies beyond the 110 in 171 that are required for you to get a CMMC level 3 certification. This isn't the place to go into them in any detail, but I hear consistently that some of them are quite difficult and will take some time and some expense to achieve. Another point is that companies are going to need to know what to expect from the assessors. You don't want to look just at the requirements and just sort of decide for yourself how the assessors will look at them. You'd like to have an assessment guide so that you can anticipate what the assessor will do when it comes to your facility. Well, we have that assessment guide for the DoD Assessment Methodology. It's already there. NIST has produced 171A. There it is. And there are other things from the MEP, I think, where it can help you kind of figure out what the assessors will be looking for. And where you are doing your own self-assessment, well, I mean, the natural thing to use if you need more information about how to have an accurate, valid self-assessment is 171A. It's in being and in place. By contrast, if we're thinking about a CMMC level 3 certification, well, the 171A is not going to get you there because it doesn't touch the other 20 practices and policies. DoD is working on an assessment guide for level 3, and I'm sure it's working on one for level 1, but we haven't seen those things yet. Now, one of the questions you might be wondering perhaps is, where does level 2 fit into this? I'm so glad you asked. Level 2 is sort of described as an intermediary step. In other words, you might seek a certification as level 2 as a way to show that you are more than level 1, but not quite yet ready for level 3. This certainly has not been filled out. My own view, as I have expressed in writings and to DoD, is that level 3 is most important, and level 4 and 5 are way more important than level 3, but those ought to be dealt with for now by the requiring activity via tailored requirements, and that we should not even get close to trying to impose upon, the mass of level 3 contractors the challenges of 4 or 5. I've also wondered, what purpose level 2 serves. So I like the idea that it could be kind of a waypoint where it would show that you're, better than level 1, which is very basic, just the 15 general requirements of the FAR basic safeguarding clause. And it could also give, customers confidence that even if you're not at level 3 now, they'll know that you're at level 2 and you're on your way. Remember, it is a maturity model, and maturity has different levels. If level 1 were, let's not say infantile, that's not it. And I don't like this idea. I was going to say if level 1 is infantile and level 5 is aged, that doesn't play. But you get the idea. Companies may start at level 1, but they may have a business plan or objective to get to a higher level. And there will be companies who will seek to have above level 3 certification is a way to have positive business discriminators when the security really counts. Now, some of you may also be wondering, okay, so I do this basic assessment and I report myself as having a 90. And I'll take the chance the Dcma is going to come to review me. If they will, fine, I've got my documentation, I'm ready to explain it. And I'm working to close those poems. All good. But you may be asking yourself, well, gee, I work with a lot of primes, and am I supposed to give this number to them? Are they going to demand it? Well, the answer is no, and probably. The reporting of the basic assessment is done by you, a contractor, again, subject to 7012 and possessed of CUI. You, that contractor, self-assess, and you submit that self-assessment to SPRS yourself. You are not obligated by the regulation to provide it to any teaming partner or prime contractor, nor is there anything in the regulation that allows a prime contractor, a higher tier subcontractor, or a teaming partner to get it from SPRS. SPRS is only accessible to government persons. But you should know also that flow down is a very clear requirement of all 3 new clauses, 19, actually it's a very clear requirement of 20 and 21. 19 is a solicitation notice and 20 is the contract clause for DoD assessment. The flow down requirement is extremely clear. It says that if you get the -20 clause and you are subject to the DoD assessment, you must flow that clause down to every subcontractor, including commercial items and excluding only pure COTS. And the -21 clause for CMMC requirements operates essentially the same way, mandatory flow down. Well, if you're the prime and you have this flow down obligation, and say Katie is right that you're a prime and you have 150 subcontractors, are you going to simply flow it down and hope? Well, probably not, since you're ultimately responsible for contract compliance. So I expect that the primes are going to, quote, ask, unquote, you, the subs, what your self-assessment is and what you reported to SPRS. Now, and they can. I mean, although they can't get it from SPRS, they can certainly ask. And what I've expected is that there will be solicitations, RFQs, requests for bids from prime contractors where they're going to ask you, the sub, what is your score today? Or they may say, we're willing to entertain people that have a score of over 70 today, but it is quite possible that they will, right? They can say, they can allow you to bid now, even if you don't have any score submitted, but they cannot make an award to you unless you have submitted your score. That's the that's the break point, both at the DoD level and at the subcontract level. DoD made the decision that it is willing to let you bid on things if you commit to have the score in place at the time of award, and primes can do the same thing. Now, the question was asked to Katie earlier, another session I was on with her. Well, what happens if you promise you're going to do it and you don't have it? Well, that's going to be an ugly situation. She didn't quite answer the question. My answer is that if you read the regulation according to its terms, what it tells you is that if you are required to have a CMMC level 3, or you are required to have submitted a basic assessment, or you are required to have a medium DoD assessment, if you don't have those things at the time of award, you cannot be awarded the contract. I would rather not try to find out how that works. So what I do expect will happen is that primes are going to ask their supply chain to inform them what their self-assessed scores are under the basic assessment. And they may say that a condition to participating in our supply chain on this program will be your informing us of your basic assessment score. And if the prime is acting itself under this contract clause at the prime level, well, it really has no choice other than to do that, because it must flow down the clause. And I don't think a prime would consider it a responsible or contractually valid action to sort of hire anybody for the supply chain without any knowledge of what their cyber self-assessment was. They can agree to keep it confidential. This is going to be awkward because people keep these kind of things private sometimes. But what I think will happen is that it will become industry custom that there will be non-disclosure agreements, or teaming agreements, or prime sub agreements where people do submit for limited purposes their score without any of the detail. And I also think that some companies will want to make a competitive discriminator out of how good their score is or how good their security is. That said, DoD does not want everybody and their brother or sister to advertise what their score is, or whether they got a high assessment or medium. And they certainly don't want everybody to make available the details of their score, asterisk, because the more you put out about your relative security or insecurity, the greater the possibility that the ever-present adversary is going to sort of decide to make you a target because of your professed vulnerability. Now, here's another thing to consider. I mentioned to you that you start out with this, you have to do this self-assessment, and that you have a maximum score of 110, and that you have a net effective score is what you submit. Well, you should be wondering, well, what do I have to submit to SPRS? Do I have to submit all the details? Do I have to submit, the sheet that shows which ones I meet and which ones I don't? No, you don't. You submit the score, and you submit essentially the date that you expect that you are going. Under the form. Let's see if I can get to it here. Okay. Under this form, if you can see it, you submit your total score, 62, whatever, and you submit the date's score of 110 will be achieved. There's nothing for an attachment. You don't submit your system security plan. You don't submit the self-assessment. You don't submit the scoring worksheet, and you don't submit the POAMs, just the score and the promise date. That's good, because if you had to share all that stuff, it would really be kind of a target for your vulnerabilities. But again, sort of to close where I began, you should appreciate that it isn't like before when you were just self-attesting. Before, if you took a contract with 7012, you were saying, I self-attest that as of January 1st, 2018, I deliver adequate security in accordance with SP 800-171. But nobody came to check. Well, here, nobody may come to check either under the DoD assessment, but you have to submit that self-assessment. It's not just self-attestation to yourself. You have to submit a self-assessment, and they may come to check, and they have the right to do so by operation of these clauses and this regulation. And so it's kind of a new ballgame out there. Same requirements, but to paraphrase a government official I spoke to recently, we really mean it, and I think they do. Now, the challenge for industry is going to be how to translate these objectives, which we all share, with methods that we can afford and which are practicable and which will not drive companies out of the defense industrial base. It's not going to be easy. I don't think there's any single solution for any set of companies. So it's going to require a lot of skilled and resourceful assets to come up with the best way to solve these problems and deliver the security that you want as a competitive matter and for compliance, and which DoD and your primes want for purposes of contract compliance and national security. I will stop there, and I thank everyone for their endurance in listening to this.
And we are very humbled that you shared that with us. I know with those new interim rules out, things have changed a little bit, so we do appreciate that breakdown. A few questions for you, sir, if you have time.
Sure.
Some of these questions look like they might be, let's say,
impossible to answer?
They might be kind of tough to answer. So I guess I'll go with the first question. In your opinion, sir, will there be more than one accreditation body for CMMC?
Well, let's start out with the hard stuff. I deliberately stayed away from any discussion of how CMMC AB operates. Right now, my strong impression is that DoD remains committed to the AB as the single accreditation body. Katie Arrington speaks a lot of times at a lot of places, and there's always good content there. And she spoke at something else that I listened to this morning. I was also a speaker after her. And what I heard was a full-throated endorsement of the AB and a determination that they were the means to go. What do I think personally? I don't know. I think it's conceivable that we could see other sources of accreditation. It is conceivable that there are means of reciprocity available so that we could draw upon different methods of accreditation. I don't see that as happening in the near term, but I would not rule it out. This is speaking only for myself as a personal opinion.
Yeah, I understand that answer, sir. Next question is kind of, I guess, on the similar lines of that. Why doesn't Dcma do these assessments instead? And you kind of touched on this a little bit in your presentation. Do these assessments instead of establishing a non-for-profit AB? Why can't Dcma just award a sub or a prime contract to a contractor to do these assessments, even from a level 1 to level 5? I know this is just your opinion. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't part of this decision, needless to say. I've asked the same questions. I know that there was a decision made to go with a nonprofit and to call upon people to volunteer effort, which some have done to the tune of hundreds of hours. I do not know the reasoning behind it. However, I do know something of the people who were involved in the decision and at least have some glimmer of a guess into some of the legal issues and constraints. So I have to assume that there were good reasons to make this decision initially. I have written, however, that we could reach a point where the demands made upon a volunteer organization and a nonprofit are just too big, where we're asking people to, take time away from their product or paying work to do work that is too important and too demanding. So, I think we ought to consider ways for DoD to provide funding to the AB, and through the AB is one possibility that could raise some challenges under acquisition laws. I think there are other mechanisms that could be considered. In other areas where there is a public-private interest in, let's call them shared security problems, such as industrial base or certain forms of manufacturing technology or certain weapon systems, you see the establishment of consortia where it might be created by a government organization, OSDA&S, where it is working through an intermediary, the AB or someone else, and where other transaction funding is used for design and prototypes, pilot projects, and the like. I do think those things need to be explored because we're putting an awful lot of responsibility on a new organization where the work is largely being done by capable volunteers, but I mean, it's a lot to do. And when they make mistakes, social media has been quick to comment upon them, sometimes adversely, and I have been among those who have sometimes been very critical. So, we want to make it work. I have no problem, pursuing the same course we're on, but we need to be thinking about how to do it better, faster, smarter, and with higher trustworthiness and accountability.
Exactly. Thank you, sir, for that. Two more questions. I'm going to put them into one for you. And I don't know, I'm just going to read them. How is this affecting, in your opinion, small, medium-sized businesses from a cost perspective?
Well, that's really the most important question of the day. There's a huge amount of detail in the regulation about the effect on small and medium-sized businesses. That's required. I put on a LinkedIn post that sought to explain, why that was done. The initial assumption that's made and explicit in the regulation is that the cost for small businesses of submitting that self-assessment for the basic level is not too high. And the reason that they reach that conclusion is because the requirement's been in place for several years. It's going to be hard to challenge that. I think it is a question of enormous importance. We continue to hear, let's say anecdotally, that this is going to be too hard and too expensive for small business. I also see many indications of companies, perhaps some who are on this call, who are making it their business to find affordable solutions. I do think that we are going to see more use of managed service providers and managed security service providers. And as I've spoken about separately, I think that cloud will come to have a bigger place through a number of different instantiations in the solution. There are many details of how those would be worked out. And right now, cloud can be awfully expensive. But I think it's, here's the problem. Adversaries tend to go to those in the supply chain they may think are weakest. They have the means, the leverage, the scale, the size to do it. So it isn't ever going to work to exclude smaller companies from compliance. It also is not going to work to make compliance so expensive that small companies and innovators either leave the defense industrial base or choose not to participate. So we've got a lot of work to do, industry and government, to find a way for small and medium-sized businesses to deliver this security, without making it unaffordable. One thing that Katie has said recently is that if you get the new requirement in a contract clause on a new contract, well, if you haven't done it before, well, she said you can include the cost of this work as a charge in your new contract. How well that works in terms of government cost accounting, I'm not entirely sure. Whether that fits as a competitive condition, I'm not sure either. I appreciate that DoD is aware of the cost issue. I do believe that they are sensitive to the burdens on small and medium-sized businesses. I'm encouraged by some of the innovation and cleverness being shown in the emerging marketplace of solution providers. But I think, we're closer to the 20-yard line than we are to the goal line on the other side of the field.
Well said. I agree with everything you just said, Bob. Bob, my colleague, my friend, I really appreciate your time, and it's always a pleasure and an
Still
honor.
there?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Hold on, I'm not hearing anything. Stand by.